Fight breakdown, the debate at Mahishi. Fight breakdown, the debate at Mahishi, approximately 5 years after the encounter at Govinda's cave. The boy who had become a young man walked into the courtyard of the most distinguished Mimamsa scholar in northern India and proposed a debate. The young man was now somewhere between 16 and 21 years old. The accounts vary, the dating is loose. He had completed his apprenticeship under Govinda, who had, by some accounts on his deathbed, sent his prodigy disciple to engage Mandana Misra at the village of Mahishi, in what is now the state of Bihar. The instruction was specific: defeat Mandana, and the household Brahmin establishment of North India will follow. Govinda had identified the central node of the network. To convert that node was to convert the network. The young man walked across the subcontinent for the second time in his life. He arrived in Mahishi during a season of household ritual. What followed is the most carefully recorded debate in the Advaita Vedanta tradition, the central event of Shankara's intellectual career, and the second of the great fights. We slow down. We will spend the chapter inside it. The setting: Mahishi is a small town in the modern state of Bihar, on the Gangetic plain. In the early 9th century, it was a center of Mimamsa learning. Several distinguished scholars lived there or in its environs. The most distinguished was Mandana Misra, who had inherited his learning from his teacher Kumarila Bhatta, the most influential Mimamsaka of the previous generation. The houses of the scholars were arranged around a central area where ritual fires were maintained, where students gathered, and where formal disputations were held. The disputations were a regular feature of Mahishi's intellectual life. Visiting scholars would propose a topic. The local senior scholars would respond. The engagement could last hours, days, or, in cases involving major doctrinal questions, weeks. The audience for such debates consisted of senior students, rival scholars, householders interested in the ritual implications of the doctrines being argued, and traveling Brahmins who would carry the news of the result back to other centers of learning. This last point matters for our analysis. The audience was not local. The audience was the entire intellectual network of orthodox Brahmanism in North India. Whatever was decided at Mahishi would be reported, and the reports would propagate. A debate at Mahishi was, in effect, a debate before the entire establishment. The season was probably autumn. The accounts suggest a period when ritual obligations were heavy, which fits with the post-monsoon period when the harvest cycle and the ancestral rites converge. The weather would have been hot in the middle of the day, cooling in the evenings. The debate would have been conducted in the courtyard during daylight hours, with breaks for meals and household duties. The opponent Mandana Misra was, by any measure, the most formidable opponent Shankara would ever face. He was a householder, married, a master of the Vedic ritual literature, fluent in the arguments of the Mimamsa school and several others. He had written substantial works of philosophy. The Brahma Siddhi, attributed to him, is one of the major Mimamsa Vedanta texts of the period. He held a position of great social respect. The village deferred to him, his household was prosperous, and his daily life was conducted according to the ritual prescriptions he defended in his writings. He was also, on the accounts, intellectually generous. He was not a sectarian in the worst sense. He had read the Upanishads, knew the Sankhya, knew the Buddhist literature, and could argue the Mimamsa case against each of these without strawmanning. The debates he had conducted in Mahishi over the previous 2 decades had established him as someone whose engagements with opponents were thorough. The Mimamsa school he represented was committed to a single central thesis. The Vedas are the authoritative source of knowledge concerning what is to be done. The rituals they prescribe are efficacious for the ends they are prescribed for, and the highest of these ends, moksha, is itself attainable through the meticulous performance of the prescribed action. The doctrine had centuries of textual support, ritual practice, and philosophical defense behind it. Mandana was not the first defender of this position, he was its most articulate living defender. There was a further feature of the encounter that distinguished it from any other debate Shankara had been in or would be in. Mandana's wife, Abhay Bharati, was herself a scholar of the first rank. She is described in the traditional accounts as a learned woman, fluent in Sanskrit, conversant with the philosophical literature, and the intellectual equal of her husband. Her name itself, Abhay Bharati, Bharati of both, is sometimes interpreted as a reference to her competence in both sides of any disputation. By agreement of both parties, she would serve as the umpire of the debate. Both Shankara and Mandana accepted her as such. The umpire's authority would not be questioned. This is a remarkable feature for the period and the milieu. We will return to it. The pre-fight Shankara's approach to Mahishi has been preserved in considerable detail, because every move in the approach is a setup for a move in the debate. He arrived at the outskirts of the village and asked some women, returning from the river with water pots on their heads, where the house of Mandana Misra was. The women, instead of giving directions, answered in Sanskrit verses, telling Shankara that he would find the house of Mandana Misra to be the one outside, which even the parrots in cages were debating philosophical questions. Shankara, finding such a house, knew he had arrived at the right address. The story is sometimes told as a vivid local color detail. It is, in fact, a piece of strategic intelligence. Shankara has just learned that Mandana's household is so saturated with philosophical discourse that the household birds have absorbed the vocabulary. The household is not merely a residence, it is a school. The audience present at any debate would not be casual. It would consist of advanced students whose ears were trained for the technical vocabulary. Shankara's preparation, on entering, would need to include a register sufficient for that audience. He approached the house. Mandana at that moment was conducting a shraddha, a ritual offering to ancestors, a major householder duty performed annually. The performance of shraddha was supposed to be inviolable, nothing should interrupt it. The arrival of a sannyasi, a renunciate, at the door of a shraddha was, by traditional reckoning, inauspicious. Mandana noticed Shankara at the door and was immediately displeased. What does a sannyasi want at a shraddha? Shankara waited. He did not respond to the displeasure. He did not attempt to open the conversation by pushing past the host's frame. He waited for the ritual to be completed. This is significant in light of what we have studied in Part II. Shankara is conceding by his behavior at the door the legitimacy of the ritual context. He is allowing the shraddha its full weight. He is establishing, before any words have been exchanged, that he is not present to disrupt. The strategic concession has begun before the debate has begun. When the shraddha was complete, Mandana came to the door and addressed Shankara. The accounts preserve the exchange in stylized form. Mandana asked sharply why a sannyasi was at his door. Shankara answered with a Vedic verse, selected to indicate that he was not, in fact, intending disrespect to the ritual context, and that his approach was within the bounds of the tradition Mandana himself defended. Mandana's hostility softened. The two men recognized each other as fellow traditionalists, however disagreeing. The terms of the debate were then set. The accounts agree on the essentials. Either party would defend his position, the other would attempt to refute it. The umpire would be Abhay Bharati. Both parties would wear fresh flower garlands at the start of the debate. Whichever party's garland wilted first would be judged the loser. The stakes: if Shankara was defeated, he would abandon sannyasa and become a householder. If Mandana was defeated, he would abandon his household, take sannyasa, and become Shankara's disciple. These are not light stakes. Shankara was being asked to give up his life's commitment if he lost. Mandana was being asked to give up his household, his wife, his ritual practice, his social position. Both parties were betting their lives on the outcome. The debate opened with the move we have already studied at length. Shankara conceded the entire Mimamsa system in advance. He stated, in detail and at length, that the Vedic rituals were efficacious for the ends they were prescribed for. He stated that the householder's life, properly conducted, was a sound stage of human existence. He stated that the textual authority of the Vedas was beyond question for the matters they addressed. He stated that Mandana's learning in the Mimamsa was deeper than his own, and that he, Shankara, was not in a position to teach Mandana the Mimamsa. He stated that the apparent dispute between renunciate and householder traditions was, in his view, less of a dispute than was sometimes thought, and that on most matters he and Mandana would agree. He then narrowed the question. The matter at issue, he said, was a single proposition. Is moksha, final liberation, the result of action? The Mimamsa held that it was, specifically, that the meticulous performance of prescribed action, including ritual action, was the proximate cause of liberation. Shankara held that it was not, that liberation was the recognition of one's identity with Brahman, and that this recognition could not be the result of any action, ritual, or otherwise. This was the stasis of the debate. Notice that it is a stasis of quality in the framework. Both parties accepted that moksha existed and was desirable. Both parties accepted that ritual existed and had effects. The question was what kind of effects, specifically whether one of those effects was moksha. The stasis was not over the existence of liberation, the value of liberation, or the validity of ritual. It was over the precise causal relation between ritual and liberation. The narrowing of the stasis was itself an act of considerable rhetorical skill. Shankara had located the disagreement at a single point and isolated it from every adjacent topic on which the parties agreed. The audience, by this point, understood what they were watching. The question was technical. The two parties were the most qualified people in the region to argue it. The debate would proceed on the merits. Days 1 and 2, the inferential cage. Shankara's first move after the framing was the three-question cage we studied. He asked Mandana 3 questions, each of which Mandana could not refuse without abandoning Mimamsa. Question 1. Is moksha real? Mandana answered yes. The goal of liberation is foundational to all the orthodox darshanas, and the Mimamsa accepts it as the highest of the Purusharthas. Question 2. Is moksha attainable through the prescribed rituals, as the Mimamsa holds? Mandana answered yes. This is the core thesis of his school. Question 3. Are the rituals and the actions they consist of performed in time, with a beginning and an end? Mandana answered yes. This is a definitional truth about action. Action that does not begin and end is not action, it is something else. The 3 answers were now banked. Shankara then walked the inference. Anything that has a beginning and an end in time is anitya, impermanent. Moksha, by the agreement of both parties and indeed of all the darshanas, is nitya, eternal, without beginning or end. The impermanent cannot be the cause of the eternal. What begins and ends produces what begins and ends. What is beginningless and endless is not produced. Therefore action, including ritual action, cannot be the proximate cause of moksha. The Mimamsa central thesis, as stated, is incompatible with the agreed nature of moksha. The argument was clean. It used only premises Mandana had supplied. It introduced no contested principles. It walked from agreed starting points to a contested conclusion in a small number of well-known inferential steps. Mandana saw the cage. He had walked into it because the alternatives, refusing the questions, hedging on the answers, denying the eternality of moksha, would have been worse. To refuse to answer would have been to refuse the debate. To hedge would have given Shankara grounds for further questions. To deny moksha's eternality would have damaged the Mimamsa more than Shankara's argument would. Mandana mounted his first defense. He distinguished, as the Mimamsa tradition allowed, between ordinary action and Vedic action. Ordinary action, he conceded, has effects bounded in time and could not produce a timeless result. But Vedic action, karma prescribed in the Vedas, was not, on the Mimamsa account, ordinary action. It produced an unseen residue called a purva, which persisted across time in a way that ordinary effects did not. The apurva was the bridge between temporally bounded ritual and atemporal liberation. This is a sophisticated move. The Mimamsa school had developed the apurva doctrine precisely to handle this kind of objection. Shankara could not dismiss it without engaging it. He engaged it. The apurva, you say, persists across time in a way ordinary effects do not. But persistence across time is itself a temporal property. Whatever persists in time has a beginning, an ending, and a duration. The apurva is in time, even if it lasts longer than the ritual that produced it. It is therefore in time as moksha is not, and the gap between the two has not been closed by the apurva, it has only been pushed one step further away. The apurva defense collapsed. Mandana could see it collapsing. The first day's debate ended with Mandana pressed and Shankara holding the line. The second day proceeded similarly. Mandana mounted further defenses from the technical apparatus of the Mimamsa. Distinctions between kratvartha, action with the ritual itself as its end, and purushartha, action with a person's good as its end. Arguments from the eternality of the Vedas. Arguments from the fitness of ritual for cultivating the precise mental dispositions associated with liberation. Each defense was technical. Each was met technically. Each was either dismantled or reduced in scope. The audience was watching a master craftsman work. Days 3 and 4, the Chitta-Shuddhai turned. By the third day, Mandana had made a strategic decision. The frontal defense of moksha through karma was failing. He retreated to a more defensible position. The position was this: karma does not directly produce moksha. Karma produces Chitta-Shuddhai, the purification of the mind. Chitta-Shuddhai is the necessary precondition for the direct knowledge that produces moksha. Therefore, while karma is not the proximate cause of liberation, it is the indispensable preparation. The Mimamsa thesis, properly understood, is not that ritual action is the immediate cause of liberation, but that it is the indirect but necessary preparation. Without ritual life, no purification. Without purification, no fitness for knowledge. Without fitness for knowledge, no liberation. This is, philosophically, the strongest version of the Mimamsa case. It is a version that accepts everything Shankara has said about the temporal-eternal incompatibility and reframes the doctrine as a doctrine about preparation rather than direct causation. It is the move Mandana should have opened with, and which he opened with the second-best version of. Shankara's response is one of the most elegant moves in the debate, and it is the move we studied. He conceded the Chitta-Shuddhai claim in full. Yes, karma can produce Chitta-Shuddhai. Yes, Chitta-Shuddhai is conducive to the receipt of liberating knowledge. On these points you are correct, and I will say so plainly. He then narrowed further. But the proximate cause of moksha, even in your reformulated position, is not Chitta-Shuddhai. It is jnana, direct knowledge of one's identity with Brahman. Karma can produce the conditions for receiving jnana. It cannot produce jnana itself. Jnana arises from the right contact with the right teaching in a mind that is fit to receive it. The fitness is one condition, the teaching is another, the recognition is a third. The recognition itself is not produced by action of any kind. It is the dropping away of a misperception. The conceded role of karma, preparation for fitness, does not contradict the original thesis. It confirms it. Karma is not the cause of moksha, even on your reformulated account. It is the cultivator of the soil. The seed is jnana, and the seed's coming into fruit is not an action. The argument is precise. Shankara has accepted the strongest version of Mandana's position and shown that even in the strongest version, the Mimamsa thesis, as a thesis about causation of moksha, does not survive. The Mimamsa system survives as a system of preparation, of cultivation, of fitness, but its claim to be the path to moksha, in the strict sense, has been narrowed to a claim to be the path to fitness for moksha, and fitness for moksha is not moksha. Mandana at this point was nearly defeated. The audience could see it. The garland on Mandana's neck, by the umpire's later report, had begun to wilt. Days 5 and 6. The technical resistance Mandana did not concede. He had several days of technical resistance left in him, and he used them. He invoked particular Vedic passages that he argued prescribed liberation as the direct fruit of named rituals. Shankara responded to each, parsing the texts in their grammatical and contextual contexts, showing that the passages either did not say what Mandana claimed they said, or said it in a sense compatible with Shankara's position. He invoked the authority of Kumarila Bhatta, his teacher, who had defended the Mimamsa thesis at length. Shankara responded with respect, acknowledging Kumarila's stature, but pointing out that the technical question at hand was not settled by the authority of any single teacher. It was settled by the inferential consequences of the agreed premises. He invoked considerations from the structure of householder life, that the Mimamsa thesis was not merely a philosophical position, but a way of life, and that to accept Shankara's position would be to undermine the way of life of millions of orthodox Brahmins. Shankara responded with care. He noted that he was not asking anyone to abandon ritual life. He was asking Mandana to acknowledge a precise technical point about the relation between ritual and liberation. The way of life could continue, with all its disciplines and observances. The metaphysical claim about what produced liberation was distinct from the practical question of what kind of life one should lead. Many people, Shankara observed, would continue to live as householders and would benefit from doing so. The doctrinal correction did not require a social revolution. It required a more precise understanding of what the rituals achieved. The resistance was, throughout, sophisticated. Mandana was not a weak opponent making weak moves. He was a strong opponent who had been backed into a corner that no Mimamsa scholar of the period had been backed into before. The audience was watching the doctrinal foundations of an entire school being relocated by patient, technical work. Day 7, the garland on the 7th day, Abhaya Bharati spoke. She had been silent throughout, the proper posture of an umpire, intervening only when the debate required arbitration. She spoke now to call the party's attention to the garlands. Shankara's was fresh. Mandana's was wilted. The garland convention had served as an external indicator of who, in the umpire's judgment, was holding the upper hand. The convention was not arbitrary. The garlands were observed by both parties throughout, and the wilting reflected, by tradition, the relative spiritual stamina of the wearer under sustained intellectual pressure. The umpire, in calling attention to the difference, was making a public assessment. Mandana saw what was being said. He had several options. He could continue the debate, attempting to recover ground. He could insist that the garland convention was not decisive and that he had further arguments to make. He could, in extremity, dispute the umpire. He did none of these things. He looked at his garland, he looked at Shankara, he looked at his wife. He acknowledged that the debate had gone against him. He stated that he would honor the terms. He would take sannyasa and become Shankara's disciple. This was, by any reasonable assessment, the gracious response of a man whose intellectual position had been demolished by a more skilled opponent. Shankara accepted the concession. The debate appeared to be over. It was not. Day 7 continued. Abhaya Bharati intervenes. Abhaya Bharati, having pronounced the verdict on the principal debate, now spoke a second time. She made a point that, in the traditional context, was both delicate and consequential. By the doctrine of marriage, husband and wife are one. Mandana is half of me, I am half of him. If you have defeated my husband, you have defeated only half of him. To complete the victory, you must defeat me as well. This is a remarkable move on several levels. First, it preserves Mandana's defeat. Abhaya Bharati does not dispute that her husband has been out-argued. Second, it extends the contest by introducing an opponent Shankara has not yet faced. Third, it draws on a doctrine Shankara himself has not disputed and would be unwilling to dispute, the doctrine of marriage as ontological union. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, it puts Shankara in the position of having to debate a woman in front of an entire establishment of orthodox Brahmins, which was a contest with significant social stakes, regardless of which way it went. Shankara accepted. He could not refuse without contradicting the very tradition he was teaching from. The debate resumed with a new opponent. Day 7 still continued. Kamashastra Abhay Bharati's first question was unexpected. She did not press Shankara on the Mokshakama question. She moved to a different domain entirely. Expound, please, on the Kamashastra, the science of erotic love and household relations. The choice of subject is not capricious. Abhay Bharati had identified the one major area in which Shankara, as a lifelong renunciate, had no experience. He had been a sannyasi since the age of 8. He had not lived as a householder, he had not married, he had not engaged with the domain of sexuality and partnership. The classical Kamashastra was the work of householders, written for householders, presupposing the lived knowledge of householder life. Shankara had read the texts, he had not lived them. The move is a commitment extraction trap of a different kind. Abhay Bharati has selected the domain in which Shankara's preparation is incomplete. She is asking him to perform expertise he does not possess. Shankara recognized the trap. He had two options. First, he could attempt to answer from textual study alone, which Abhay Bharati would detect and would expose. Second, he could request an adjournment. He requested an adjournment. He asked for 6 months. Abhay Bharati granted it. The interregnum, the traditional accounts, here describe an episode that has, in subsequent centuries, been treated by some commentators as historical and by others as allegorical. The accounts agree on the structure even when they vary on the literal content. Shankara, during the 6-month adjournment, performed parakaya pravesha, the entry into another body. A king named Amaruka had died recently. His body was preserved, awaiting the rites. Shankara left his own body in a cave guarded by his disciples and entered Amaruka's body. He spent 6 months living the life of a king with multiple wives, learning at first hand the domain Abhay Bharati had asked him to expound. At the end of the 6 months, he returned to his own body, walked back to Mahishi, and delivered the teaching. The reader is invited to read this episode in whichever register they prefer, as historical event, as didactic legend, or as allegorical statement that even renunciate philosophy must, on occasion, take detailed knowledge of householder existence on board to make complete sense of life. What the tradition records is that Shankara did not bluff. He did not attempt to fake expertise he lacked. He acknowledged the gap and acquired the knowledge, by whatever means the accounts assign him, before resuming the debate. The principle in our terms is unimpeachable. When the opponent has identified a real gap in your preparation, do not pretend, close the gap, then return. He returned. He answered Abhay Bharati's questions on Kamashastra. The accounts say that her questions were searching and that his answers were complete. She conceded. Mandana, with both halves of himself defeated, took sannyasa under the name Shurshvara. He became one of Shankara's 4 principal disciples. He wrote, after his initiation, the Naishkamya Siddhi, the establishment of the doctrine of non-action, which is among the most important commentarial works in the Advaita tradition, and which contains, in formal philosophical form, the very arguments Shankara had used against him in the courtyard at Mahishi. The man who had defended the Mimamsa thesis with the greatest skill of his generation became its most rigorous critic. This is what the converted opponent looks like in the dialectical tradition. The convert is not the weakened opponent. The convert is the opponent. Strong enough to recognize that the new position is correct. and willing to bring the full force of their previous training to its defense. The modern parallel, Lincoln Douglas at Freeport, the closest modern parallel to Mahishi, is the second of the 7 Lincoln Douglas debates held at Freeport, Illinois, on 27 August 1858. Lincoln, at Freeport, had prepared 4 questions for Douglas. The second was the killer. Can the people of a United States territory, in any lawful way, against the wish of any citizen of the United States, exclude slavery from its limits prior to the formation of a state constitution? The question was a 3-question cage of the kind we studied. To answer yes was to alienate the South. The answer would directly contradict the Dred Scott decision of the previous year, which Douglas had publicly endorsed, and which had effectively ruled that no territorial body could exclude slavery. To answer no was to alienate the Illinois audience that day and most of the Northern Democrats whose votes Douglas needed to retain his Senate seat. Douglas gave what became known as the Freeport Doctrine. He answered, in effect, yes by indirection. The people of a territory could not legally prohibit slavery, but they could effectively exclude it by refusing to pass the enabling police regulations that protected slaveholders' property. The answer satisfied the immediate Illinois audience. Douglas won the Senate seat in 1858. The answer also destroyed his presidential candidacy in 1860. The Southern wing of the Democratic Party, 2 years later, refused to nominate a candidate who had given the Freeport answer. The party split. The split allowed Lincoln to win the presidency with under 40% of the popular vote. The Civil War followed. Lincoln at Freeport had made a move whose effect was sequential. The immediate effect was minor. The medium-term effect was decisive. The cage Lincoln had built around Douglas held across 2 years, 2 elections, and 1 civil war. It was, as a piece of debating, the equivalent of Shankara's 3-question cage at Mahishi, a sequential commitment extraction whose force depended on the opponent being unable to answer in any of the available ways without significant damage. The parallel is not perfect. Mahishi was a single sustained engagement. Freeport was one moment in a longer political contest. Mandana's defeat ended in conversion. Douglas's defeat ended in death 2 years later. But the structural move is the same. Identify the position whose defense requires the opponent to commit, in front of an audience, to claims that cannot be coherently held together. Force the commitment, bank the contradiction, let the contradiction run.